In broad daylight on a Harlem street, Carlo Moretti slapped a 67-year-old elder across the face and walked away laughing. He had badge money, Brooklyn muscle, and the full Italian syndicate behind him. But within 72 hours, every door in Harlem closed on him simultaneously. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that made an entire Mafia network erase one of their own? To understand, we go back to where it began. The September heat in Harlem that afternoon was the kind that made old men sit still and young men do stupid things. The air smelled like frying pork fat, garbage baking in the sun, and the sour edge of a neighborhood that had been squeezing itself dry for years just to survive. The market on 125th Street was loud, the way a crowded church is loud, everybody talking, nobody listening. The whole thing vibrating at a frequency that meant life was still happening here, still pushing forward, still real. Elijah Wade moved through that market the way water moves through familiar ground. 67 years old, hickory cane, brown felt hat he wore in August like he wore it in February. He had buried 2 wives and raised 5 children in this neighborhood. He had fed families during the Depression by organizing food lines out of his own pocket. When he walked down a Harlem block, men twice his size nodded first. That was not sentiment. That was the specific currency that Harlem ran on, the kind you cannot print, cannot steal, and cannot buy from Brooklyn. Carlo Moretti knew exactly what that currency was worth. That is precisely why he came to destroy it in public. Moretti's black sedan rolled up to the market at 2:30. He stepped out in a white linen jacket, a jacket that cost more than most men on that block made in a month. And he walked toward Elijah Wade the way a man walks toward something he has already decided to break. 2 soldiers stayed close behind him. Nobody blocked his path. Nobody said a word. Elijah saw him coming and did not move. What Moretti said first has been reported differently by different people. Some witnesses heard him demand a meeting. Others said he was talking about money. What every single person who was there agreed on, and there were more than 40 of them, was what happened next. Moretti's right hand came up fast and flat and hit Elijah Wade across the left side of his face so hard that the old man's hat flew off, and his cane hit the pavement with a crack that cut straight through the market noise like a gunshot. Elijah stumbled into the vegetable stall behind him. Tomatoes fell and split open on the hot concrete, bleeding red into the dust. A woman screamed once and then stopped. The entire market went silent in the space of 2 seconds. Vendors, shoppers, children, everyone frozen like somebody had yanked the power cord out of the whole neighborhood. Moretti looked around at all of them. He took his time. He straightened his jacket with both hands and looked at the crowd the way a man looks at furniture. Then he said, loud and slow, so there would be no confusion, "Next time this neighborhood wants to do business with me, send somebody who understands how business works." He walked back to the sedan. The door closed. The car pulled away. Nobody chased it. Nobody threw anything. Nobody even moved for what felt like a full minute but was probably closer to 10 seconds. A teenage boy bent down and picked up Elijah's cane and held it out without meeting the old man's eyes. An older woman put her hand on Elijah's arm and said his name softly. He did not answer her. He took the cane, straightened himself with enormous effort and enormous dignity, and walked home without looking back at any of them. The red tomatoes dried on the concrete in the afternoon heat. Nobody cleaned them up until the following morning. By 5 o'clock, that story had traveled every block in Harlem. By 6, it had grown in some places and shrunk in others the way living stories always do. But the core of it never changed because too many people had been standing there with their own 2 eyes open. Some details from that afternoon come to us through oral history rather than formal documentation, which is how most of Harlem's truest stories have survived. passed from person to person because nobody with a badge or a briefcase was interested in writing them down at the time. What the story carried, in every version, was the same unbearable weight. Moretti had not just hit an old man. He had hit the specific old man that Harlem had decided to protect. He had done it in the middle of the day in the middle of the market in front of 40 witnesses, and every one of those witnesses had stood completely still and let it happen. That was the real message, not the slap. The stillness. Moretti had walked into the heart of Harlem and shown everyone watching that their loyalty to each other had a ceiling. And that ceiling was one man with 2 soldiers and the right kind of nerve. He had come to prove that Harlem's social order was a performance, not a foundation, and that a hard enough hit at the right moment would crack it open for anyone willing to be brutal enough to try. He drove back to Brooklyn that evening, believing he had just won something significant. He was right about the significance. He was catastrophically wrong about who had won. Bumpy Johnson heard what happened at 611 that evening. He was in the back room of a barber shop on 133rd Street, a room that smelled like mentholated shaving cream, cigarette smoke, and old wood. The room had no windows. The light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling on a short cord. 3 men were playing cards. Bumpy was one of them. The messenger came in, said what he had to say in under a minute, and then stood waiting. Bumpy set his cards face down on the table. He picked up his cigarette from the ashtray, drew on it slowly, and let the smoke out through his nose. He said nothing. The other 2 card players said nothing either. The only sound in that room was the distant noise of the street outside and the quiet tick of a clock on the shelf behind the door. 2 full minutes passed. Then Bumpy said, "How many people watched it happen?" The messenger said 40. Maybe more. Bumpy nodded once, slowly. The way a doctor nods when the test result confirms what he already suspected. He said, "Go home." The messenger left. Bumpy stood up, put on his jacket, and walked out into the Harlem evening without explaining himself to the 2 men still sitting at the card table. He did not go to find Moretti. He did not send men to Brooklyn. He did not call a meeting of Harlem's operators or put out word through any of the channels that would have told the neighborhood something was coming. He went home. He ate. He slept 8 hours. The neighborhood nearly lost its mind. By the following morning, the barbershops and the stoops and the back corners of every restaurant in Harlem were burning with the same terrified question, why hadn't Bumpy done anything? The theories moved fast and ugly. Maybe Brooklyn had too many men this time. Maybe the Italian syndicate had made threats that went higher than anyone knew. Maybe Bumpy was finished. Maybe the era was over. Maybe Harlem was going to have to learn a new name to fear. Bumpy let every single one of those conversations happen. He had people in every room where they were happening, and those people did not correct the record or reassure anyone. They listened and reported back, and Bumpy absorbed the information with the calm expression of a man reading a weather report for a storm. He has already decided what to do about. Because here is what Bumpy Johnson understood, that Carlo Moretti had never bothered to learn anger is loud and fast and visible. And visibility is a weakness when your enemy is patient. Moretti had built his move for maximum public impact. He needed the crowd. The crowd was the weapon, which meant that anyone who understood crowds understood exactly how to dismantle what Moretti had built, and it had nothing to do with guns. That afternoon, 3 men received visits, not from Bumpy himself, from men that Bumpy trusted, carrying instructions so specific and so quiet that none of the 3 knew what the others had been told. The conversations were short. They happened in private. Nothing was written down. Each man left the conversation with a clear understanding of one thing he needed to do differently, starting the following morning. And a clear understanding that this change was not to be discussed with anyone who did not already know about it. The first was a numbers banker who ran 4 collection points on the north end of the neighborhood. The second was a warehouse operator whose loading dock handled goods that moved through Harlem on routes that Moretti's people had come to depend on without fully realizing it. The third was a restaurant owner who sat at the intersection of 3 different streams of information and whose dining room had become, without anyone formally deciding this, the place where certain kinds of agreements got made over food. 3 conversations, 12 instructions total. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would look like anything to an outsider watching from the street. By midnight, the first pieces had moved. By the following morning, the shape of what Bumpy was building had begun to exist in the world, invisible and load-bearing, like the frame of a building before the walls go up. Harlem kept waiting for the gunshot. Bumpy Johnson had decided the gunshot was exactly what Moretti was prepared for, so he gave him something else entirely. On the first night after the slap, Moretti's collectors drove up from Brooklyn and everything went normally. The envelopes were ready. The counts were right. 2 Harlem operators paid what they owed. The bag went into the trunk, and the car drove south without a single problem. Moretti heard the report and felt his point had been made clearly enough. On the second night, 1 operator wasn't there. His replacement, a young man who had worked that station for 2 years but had never run it alone, told the collector there had been a problem with the day's count. The money would be ready in the morning. The collector looked at the young man for a long moment, decided this was not worth an incident over $40, noted it in his head, and drove back to Brooklyn. Moretti was informed. He shrugged. 1 missed night was nothing. On the third night, 4 collection points went dark at the same time. The money existed. Everyone knew the money existed. The numbers had run. The bets had been placed. The envelopes had been filled and counted and set aside. But the men who were supposed to hand those envelopes to Brooklyn's collectors were not available, or were waiting on clarification about terms that seemed to have changed, or were dealing with a problem in the count that needed to be resolved before any transfer could responsibly take place. Every explanation was different. Every explanation was polite. Not one person said the word no. Moretti's chief collector, a veteran named David, who had been extracting money from reluctant people for over a decade, drove back to Brooklyn on the third night and sat across from Moretti at his kitchen table and said very carefully, "This is not a coincidence. I don't know what it is yet, but it is not random and it is not small." Moretti stared at him. Then he made the decision that would cost him everything, though he would not understand that until much later. He decided this was a test of strength. He decided the correct answer was to send more men and make the consequences of non-payment so clear and so physical that the confusion would resolve itself immediately. 4 men drove up to Harlem the next morning. They were not subtle men. They visited 6 locations in 4 hours. At 5 of those 6 locations, they found ordinary businesses operating normally, staffed by people who expressed genuine and unshakable puzzlement about what Brooklyn was referring to, since the arrangements that had previously existed appeared to have been restructured through channels they were not personally involved in, and the person who would have the authority and information to address Brooklyn's concerns was unfortunately not reachable at this time. At the 6th location, the door was locked. A handwritten sign read, "Closed for renovation." One of those 4 men described it years later, in a conversation that was recorded and has been partially preserved. "We drove around up there for half a day. Every door we knocked on, somebody answered. Everybody was polite. Everybody had a reason. Nobody ever said no to us directly. Not one time. We came back with nothing and I still couldn't explain exactly what had happened. That was the machine Bumpy had built. In 72 hours, using 3 conversations and the trust of 20 years, He had turned Harlem's entire financial infrastructure into a maze with no exit, no confrontation, no threats, no declarations, just a neighborhood that had quietly, completely, and simultaneously stopped being accessible to the men from Brooklyn who had come to take its money. The cash flow disruption that began on that third night hit every channel Moretti had built in Harlem with the precision of something designed rather than something spontaneous. Because it was designed, every piece of it. And the man who designed it was sitting in a barber shop on 133rd Street playing cards and losing on purpose, waiting for Carlo Moretti to make one more mistake. He did not have to wait long. 4 days of silence from Bumpy Johnson had done exactly what Carlo Moretti paid for it to do. Harlem was cracking, not loudly, not all at once, but the way old wood cracks under slow weight, a sound so quiet you almost miss it until the whole thing splits open. Men who had never once questioned Bumpy's grip on the neighborhood were now asking the question. Women who ran numbers stations out of their kitchen drawers were wondering if they needed to make new arrangements. Cornermen who had paid Bumpy's tax without complaint for years were doing the math on what Brooklyn's rate might look like by comparison. 4 days of nothing had accomplished more psychological damage than 4 months of direct pressure ever could have. Bumpy walked into the meeting on the 5th day and sat down and looked at 7 people who all had the same careful expression, the expression of people who respect a man deeply and are terrified he is finished. He let them sit with that expression for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you what actually happened last Tuesday. Not the version you've been telling each other. The real version." Nobody moved. "Moretti did not come up here because of money," Bumpy said. His voice was flat and quiet, the way a very sharp knife is quiet. If this was about money, he would have sent a collector. Same as always. He came up here himself, in the middle of the afternoon, to the busiest block in this neighborhood, because he needed an audience. He needed every single person on that street to watch what he did and to watch what happened after. "You follow me." He looked around the room slowly. The slap was not the message. He said, "You standing still was the message." One man exhaled through his nose. Nobody else made a sound. "What Moretti told this neighborhood last Tuesday," Bumpy continued, "is that if you want to survive in Harlem from this point forward, you do not come to me. You do not come to any arrangement we have built together over the last 20 years. You go south to Brooklyn, and you get down on your knees in front of Carlo Moretti, and you ask him for permission. That is what he bought with one open hand and 40 witnesses. The right to be the thing this neighborhood fears more than it trusts itself." He stood up. He walked to the window. Below. The alley was empty except for a cat moving along the base of the opposite wall with the boneless confidence of something that owns every surface it touches. "He is not wrong that it worked," Bumpy said, his back still to the room. 4 days it worked exactly as intended. People on this street have been asking whether I am done, whether this is the moment Brooklyn finally gets what it has been reaching for, whether everything we have built here has an actual bottom to it, or whether it is just reputation sitting on top of air. He paused. I let them ask, because a man who defends himself before the attack is finished telegraphs his hand to everyone watching, and I have never been that kind of man. He turned back around. His face was completely still. "Moretti made one mistake," he said. "The same mistake every man makes who comes into Harlem from outside and thinks he understands what he is looking at. He looked at this neighborhood and saw fear wearing the costume of loyalty. He thought if he hit the costume hard enough in public, the fear underneath would turn in his direction." Bumpy picked up his hat from the table. "He does not understand that what holds Harlem together is not fear. It never was. And that misunderstanding is going to cost him every single thing he has." What the 7 people heard in that room over the next 2 hours has never been fully reconstructed. partly because none of them ever talked about it freely, and partly because Bumpy had designed the meeting so that each person left knowing only their piece of what was coming. It was deliberate architecture. Moretti had informants in Harlem the same way water has ways through stone patiently, invisibly, always finding the weak point. Bumpy had built his plan around that fact rather than against it. Each piece, described to the wrong person, would reveal nothing. Together, the pieces were a trap so complete that by the time Moretti saw its shape, he would already be inside it. The 7 left separately, at intervals, through different doors. The meeting had lasted less than 3 hours. By the time the last person stepped out into the Harlem afternoon, the neighborhood was still telling itself the story of a man absorbing a humiliation too large to answer. It was the last day that story was true. And somewhere in a restaurant in Brooklyn, Carlo Moretti was eating a late lunch and feeling very good about the week he had just had. He raised his glass to no one in particular. The wine was cold. The afternoon was bright. He had no idea the floor beneath him had already been removed. The boy's name was Marcus. He was 12 years old, small for his age, with the particular quality of invisibility that comes from being quiet in rooms full of loud adults. He ran errands for 3 separate establishments on the same block, a dry cleaner, a lunch counter, and a numbers station operating out of the back of a hardware store, and he moved between them so regularly and so unremarkably that most adults stopped registering his presence entirely. He was furniture with legs, and furniture hears everything. He came to Bumpy on a Thursday morning and stood in the doorway of the back room above the dry goods store and said what he had heard in 11 sentences. Bumpy listened without moving. When the boy finished, Bumpy gave him $2 and told him to go home by the most direct route and not speak about this conversation to any person alive, including his grandmother. The boy left. Bumpy sat alone for 20 minutes without saying a word to the empty room. What Marcus had overheard changed the entire foundation of the story. 6 weeks before Moretti came to the market and laid his hand across Elijah Wade's face, Elijah Wade had gone to Moretti first. Not openly. Not through any channel Bumpy knew about. Elijah had taken a bus to a restaurant in the Bronx on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles, and the smell of garlic and cigarettes permanently embedded in the walls, and sat across from one of Moretti's men and made a request. 3 families on his block were running out of food, children under 6 years old. The city's relief allocation had been cut for the 2nd straight month. Wartime rationing was strangling the legitimate supply lines that Harlem depended on, and the people with the least margin were taking the hardest hit. Elijah wanted access to a supply channel, flour, cooking oil, canned goods. In exchange, he offered the only thing he had worth offering: his voice. A quiet word in the right directions that would smooth Brooklyn's push into Harlem's northern edges, reduce the friction, make the expansion easier than it would otherwise be. He had offered his reputation to feed somebody else's hungry children. He had walked into enemy territory alone and put the most valuable thing he owned on the table. Moretti had said he would consider it. He never responded. And 6 weeks later he had come to the market and slapped the man who had made that offer across the face in front of 40 people. The cruelty of it hit Bumpy like a fist to the sternum. Moretti had not just humiliated an old man. He had waited, deliberately, until the memory of that private meeting had faded just enough to stop feeling recent. And then he had used Elijah's act of desperation as the blueprint for a public execution of everything Elijah represented. Anyone in Harlem who later found out about the Bronx meeting would understand the message instantly. Even the most respected man in the neighborhood had already gone to Brooklyn on his knees before the slap made it visible. The humiliation was not a beginning. It was a reveal. Bumpy stood up and walked to the window. The street below was loud and ordinary. A woman argued with a fish vendor over price. Two boys chased something between parked cars. The city kept moving the way it always moves, indifferent to the weight of what is being decided in the rooms above it. He thought about Elijah Wade walking alone into that restaurant in the Bronx. An old man with a cane and a brown hat, carrying nothing but his name, trying to buy food for children who were not even his. He thought about Moretti sitting across from that old man, listening to the offer, filing it away, and waiting. Something in Bumpy's chest went very cold and very still. This was no longer a fight about tribute money or territorial boundaries or the specific insult of a palm across an old man's face. This was a fight about whether Harlem had the right to protect its own people, set its own terms, and refuse to become a place where even an act of compassion could be turned into a weapon against the man who performed it. Details of what was said in those hours have been pieced together over time from people who were close to the situation. And while memories differ on specifics, the decision Bumpy made next was written clearly in everything that followed. He sent word to a man named Crawford. Crawford had been holding something for 3 months in a location connected to nothing and no one that Moretti would have thought to watch. Bumpy told him it was time to bring it in. Crawford had a ledger, and that ledger was not just going to end Carlo Moretti. It was going to make the people above Moretti do the work themselves. The ledger was the ugliest kind of beautiful thing. Green cloth cover, 15 cents at any stationery store. Water-stained at one corner and slightly warped from having been stored somewhere damp. It was the size of a man's hand. It weighed almost nothing. It contained enough information to destroy 6 careers, end 2 marriages, put 4 men in federal prison, and cause a senior figure in the Italian syndicate to quietly authorize the professional erasure of a man he had been treating like a favored nephew for 3 years. Crawford set it on the table without ceremony. Bumpy opened it. The handwriting inside was tiny and precise and completely consistent from the first page to the last. The handwriting of a man who understood that the value of what he was recording depended entirely on its accuracy and completeness. The bookkeeper's name was Soto. He had worked inside Moretti's operation for 4 years, handling the numbers that nobody was supposed to see. And he had written down every transaction he touched from the first week to the last with the quiet determination of a man building a life insurance policy against the day his employer decided he knew too much to be allowed to keep breathing. The policy had become available 3 months ago when Soto made the decision to stop working for Moretti and start working for his own survival. Crawford had made the introduction. The ledger had changed hands on a rainy Tuesday evening in the back of a laundry on 141st Street, wrapped in brown paper, for a price that was never publicly recorded. Bumpy read it cover to cover in 90 minutes. The room was completely silent except for the sound of pages turning and the distant noise of the street below. When he reached the last page, he closed the ledger and pressed both palms flat against the cover and held them there. 4 New York City police officers, 18 months of monthly payments, amounts recorded to the dollar, dates recorded to the day. A city buildings inspector whose favorable assessments had kept 2 of Moretti's warehouses operational in violation of codes that would have shut them down in a week. 3 Harlem operators, 3 men whose names Bumpy recognized. Men he had trusted. Men who had sat in rooms with him and looked him in the eye, who had been feeding information south to Brooklyn on a regular schedule while collecting their regular place in Harlem's arrangements. And then the last section, the one that made the ledger not just a weapon, but a detonator. Private payments. Off the books. Made not on behalf of the syndicate, but by Moretti personally, to 2 men who sat inside the syndicate's own coordination structure. Payments in exchange for advance information about internal syndicate deliberations, information Moretti had been using to position himself for a power consolidation that the people above him did not know was coming. He had been stealing from his bosses. He had been building a move against the organization that had protected him and funded him and given him the credibility to walk into Harlem in a linen jacket and feel untouchable. And he had recorded every payment in the same notebook where he recorded his payments to dirty cops and informants and corrupt city officials. Bumpy looked up at Roosevelt, who had been sitting across the table in complete stillness for the full 90 minutes. "He kept a book on himself," Bumpy said. Roosevelt looked at the ledger for a moment. He said, "Some men trust paper more than people. Paper never changes its story on you." "No," Bumpy said, "it just waits for the right person to read it." He did not take the ledger to a newspaper. He did not pass it to the police, who were anyway compromised by their own entries in its pages. He did not stand on a corner in Harlem and read it aloud to an assembled crowd. He used it with the precision of a man who understands that information, deployed correctly, does not need volume. It only needs accuracy and placement over the following 4 days. Specific facts from specific pages reach specific people through channels that could not be traced back to Bumpy Johnson or to anyone connected to him. A police captain found cause to examine 2 of his officers through what appeared to be a routine internal audit. A message reached the right set of ears inside the syndicate structure with enough specificity to be taken immediately and seriously. 3 Harlem operators discovered simultaneously and through apparently unrelated incidents that their private communications were not private, which produced a terror in each of them so complete and so sudden that 2 came directly to Bumpy within 48 hours and the 3rd was on a train out of the city before the week was over. Moretti still had his soldiers. He still had his warehouses. He still woke up every morning in Brooklyn believing he was 3 moves from owning the north end of Harlem's operation entirely. What he did not know yet was that the men above him had already had a conversation about him. A short conversation, the kind that ends without any instructions being written down, because the men having it are experienced enough to communicate complete meaning in very few words. The floor under Carlo Moretti had been pulled away. He just hadn't felt himself start to fall yet. Carlo Moretti stopped sleeping on a Wednesday night. And the thing that kept him awake was not a threat. It was not a phone call or a message or a man standing outside his window. It was a question he could not stop asking himself. A question that grew louder every time he tried to push it down, which one of his men was talking. That question was the first bone Bumpy pulled out. It had started at a card game on Tuesday. A runner named Piero mentioned, completely casually, between hands, that he had heard something about the warehouse arrangement on the west side of Harlem being restructured. Piero said it the way a man mentions that it might rain tomorrow. No weight behind it. No implication. Just a piece of information floating through conversation. But Moretti had gone cold the moment he heard it. The West Side warehouse arrangement involved 3 people inside his operation. 3 people only. Nobody outside those 3 was supposed to know it existed, let alone that it was changing. Moretti looked at Piero across the table and smiled, and dealt the next hand and said nothing. Then he went home and sat in his kitchen until 4 in the morning trying to build a case against each of the 3 names, turning each one over in his head the way you turn a stone, looking for what lives underneath it. He built a case against all 3. He could not rule out any of them. By the time the sun came up, he was drinking his 3rd coffee and watching the street outside his window with the particular exhausted suspicion of a man who has just discovered that his house has walls he never knew about. That was exactly where Bumpy needed him. Roosevelt delivered each piece personally, through channels so indirect that the information arrived at its destination looking like coincidence. A detail dropped in the wrong ear at the right moment. A name mentioned in a conversation that Moretti's people were known to monitor. A figure, accurate to the dollar, surfacing in a place where only a specific set of people could have put it. Each piece was small. Each piece was precise. Each piece pointed in a direction that could not be confirmed and could not be dismissed. By Thursday, Moretti had stopped trusting his own lieutenants in the specific way that poisons an organization from the inside. He was still giving orders. The men were still following them, but the room temperature had changed. There was a new quality to his meetings, a watchfulness behind every face that had not been there 2 weeks ago. A slight delay before men answered his questions that he could not have explained to anyone, but that he felt in his chest like a splinter working its way toward something vital. Harlem felt the shift before Moretti fully understood it himself. The neighborhood had been watching since the night of the slap, waiting for information that would tell it which way to lean. That information did not arrive as a declaration or an announcement. It arrived as texture, the specific texture of an organization beginning to eat itself. Word moved through Harlem the way smoke moves through a building, finding every crack, reaching every room, carrying a message that nobody had to speak aloud because everyone already understood it. The man from Brooklyn was losing his grip, and the losing was coming from inside his own walls. A shop owner on 138th Street who had been paying Brooklyn's rate for 6 months switched back to the old arrangement on a Friday without telling anyone he was doing it. A numbers banker who had been careful to maintain visible relationships with both sides stopped answering Moretti's collector's calls entirely. And when the collector showed up in person, the banker looked at him with the specific polite blankness of a man who has made a decision and has nothing further to discuss. Nobody made speeches. Nobody held a meeting. Harlem simply moved, piece by piece, back toward its own center of gravity, the way a river moves back into its bed after a flood retreats. Moretti called his 8 core men together on a Friday evening in the room above the Carroll Street restaurant. The room smelled like old grease from the kitchen below, and the sharp, particular smell of men who were nervous but working hard not to show it. Moretti stood at the head of the table and looked at 8 faces and felt something he had not felt in 20 years of running an operation. He felt alone in a room full of his own people. He put both fists on the table and leaned forward and said, "Someone in this room has been carrying information outside these walls. I do not know yet who it is, but I want that person to hear me clearly right now. When I find out, and I will find out the last conversations they ever have will be with me, in a room with no windows, and it will be very short." 8 faces looked back at him, 8 expressions of perfect loyalty. The room was so quiet that the sound of traffic from the street below was clearly audible. The ordinary noise of a city that did not care what was happening in this room, that would continue moving and breathing and existing regardless of what any man at this table decided or lost or destroyed. 3 of the 8 were genuinely loyal. 2 were waiting to see which way the situation resolved before committing. 2 had already been touched by Bumpy's operation in ways they did not fully understand, receiving information and instructions through layers of intermediaries so carefully constructed that neither man could have drawn a line from himself back to Harlem, even if he had wanted to. One had been feeding Bumpy a detailed account of Moretti's internal operations for 6 weeks through a channel that moved the information through 4 separate hands before it arrived. Each hand knowing only the hand before it and the hand after it. The whole chain designed so that cutting any single link would destroy the evidence of every other link. Bumpy received a full account of that Friday meeting by 8 o'clock Saturday morning. He listened to it without moving. When it was finished, he was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when something confirms what he has already planned for. Then he said, "He's frightened. Real frightened. The kind a man can't hide from himself anymore." He set down his coffee cup. "Good. Let him sit in it through the weekend. Monday we take the floor out completely." Taking the floor out did not involve a gun or a confrontation or anything that made noise. It involved a dinner at a restaurant on the east side of Manhattan, where Bumpy Johnson was not present and was not needed. because the work that Bumpy had done over the previous 2 weeks had already placed every necessary piece in exactly the right position. All that dinner required was for the right men to read 4 pages and make one quiet, permanent decision. Carlo Moretti was about to discover that the most dangerous sentence in his world was not a threat. It was 4 typed pages sitting face down on a white linen tablecloth. Between the appetizer course and the main course, at a dinner where nobody raised a glass. The restaurant had no sign outside. It did not need one. The men who ate there knew where it was, and every other person in the city did not need to know. The tablecloths were heavy white linen, changed twice a day. The wine glasses were crystal. Not the thick, cheap kind that rings dull when you tap it, but the thin, expensive kind that hums. The kitchen produced food that was never written on a menu because the men who used this room did not choose from lists. The owner simply knew what they wanted and had it ready. On the second Monday of October, 1943, 2 men sat at the corner table that was reserved permanently for private conversations and received a visitor between courses. The visitor sat for 8 minutes. He placed a folded envelope on the table between the 2 wine glasses, said 4 sentences, and left. The 2 men did not open the envelope until the waiter had cleared the first course, and the room had emptied of all but the 2 of them, and the quiet hum of a building that understood when to make itself absent. 4 pages inside. Typed. Clean margins. No header. No signature. No indication of origin. Just columns of figures, names, dates, and transactions arranged in the specific undecorated language of someone who understood that the information itself was the argument and required no decoration. The first man read quickly, the way men read when they have been absorbing difficult information in compressed form for decades. He finished, set his pages down, and picked up his wine glass and held it without drinking, staring at a fixed point on the tablecloth with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he already knows the answer to. The second man read more slowly. When he finished, he aligned the 4 pages with the edge of the table, squared the corners, and placed them face down beside his bread plate with the deliberate care of someone setting down something fragile. Neither spoke for almost 3 minutes. The kitchen produced a faint smell of roasting garlic and something sweet underneath it, almost like caramel. The smell of a meal that nobody at this table was going to finish. Then the first man said, "How much of this is verified?" The messenger, who had remained standing near the door, said, "Every figure, every name, every date." The first man nodded once, the nod of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already decided how to handle. He said, "Leave them." The messenger left without another word. The door closed softly. What those 4 pages showed was not a surprise in the absolute sense. Both men had felt something moving under the surface of their operation for months. A quality of misalignment in certain communications. A pattern of decisions by a particular person that optimized slightly too consistently for that person's individual position rather than for the organization's collective interest. They had noticed it the way experienced men notice things without acting on the noticing. Filing it away, waiting for the shape to clarify. The 4 pages clarified the shape completely and permanently. Moretti had been stealing information from the organization that had made him. He had been using what he stole to position himself for a power consolidation that would have reduced the 2 men at this table to significantly smaller figures in a significantly restructured arrangement. He had been doing it for at least 18 months. He had been doing it carefully and incrementally, and with enough patience that if the ledger had not been kept, if Soto had not been the specific kind of frightened man who trusts paper more than God, it might have worked. The ledger had been kept. The paper existed. The 2 men at the corner table read it on white linen between a first course they had eaten and a second course that was getting cold in the kitchen. They did not raise their voices. They did not make dramatic statements. They spoke for 11 minutes in the specific shorthand of men who have worked together long enough to communicate complete meaning in incomplete sentences. When the conversation ended, both men understood exactly what had been decided and exactly what would follow from that decision. What followed happened in 72 hours with the mechanical precision of a very old organization, removing a problem it had handled variations of many times before. Moretti's police protection ended first. A captain received a visit from a superior officer on Saturday morning, framed as a routine conversation about resource reallocation in northern precincts. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. By Saturday evening, 4 officers had been reassigned to duties in completely different parts of the city, effective immediately, without explanation or appeal. The warehouse inspection arrived Sunday morning, early, without notice, conducted by an inspector Moretti had never seen before. A small, precise man who smelled like coffee and government paperwork, and who read the building code the way it was actually written. 14 violations in 2 hours. Operation suspended pending remediation. The notice was taped to the front door of the warehouse in the specific impersonal manner of government action. A piece of paper that weighed almost nothing and meant everything. Moretti got the call about the warehouse at noon. He was still on the phone trying to reach his contact at the buildings department, a contact who was no longer returning calls, when his street captain rang from Harlem and said, "You need to come up here. I can't explain what I'm looking at over the phone." Moretti drove to Harlem that afternoon. He walked through 3 blocks of it, stopping at 4 locations, asking questions, receiving answers that were polite and complete, and told him absolutely nothing useful. The neighborhood looked exactly like it always looked. It smelled like it always smelled: fried food and exhaust, and the specific urban combination of 1,000 lives being lived in close proximity. Children were playing. Women were shopping. Men were standing on corners having conversations that paused when he walked past and resumed when he was gone. Every door he needed to open was sealed, not locked, not barred, not guarded. Sealed. The way something seals when the substance that held it together has been quietly and completely removed. He pushed, and nothing resisted him, and nothing gave. He drove back to Brooklyn in complete silence. His driver did not speak. The city moved past the car windows the way cities move, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere in Harlem behind him, in a barber shop on 133rd Street, a man was playing cards and losing deliberately and waiting for the phone call that would confirm what he already knew. The phone call came at 9 that evening. Roosevelt answered it, listened, said 2 words, and hung up. He turned to Bumpy and said, "It's done." Bumpy looked at his cards. He set them face down. He said, "All of it." Roosevelt said, "All of it." Bumpy nodded. He stood up and put on his jacket. He said, "Then tomorrow we finish it clean." The last thing Carlo Moretti lost was the weight of his own name. He kept the name itself. He kept the face and the body and the ability to walk into a room and order food and hold a fork and carry on a conversation about the weather or the war or anything that did not matter. What left him, permanently and without possibility of return, was the specific gravity that the name had carried for 20 years, the quality that made men calculate before they spoke to him, that made rooms reorganize themselves when he entered, that made his silence more threatening than other men's loudest statements. That gravity departed on a Tuesday evening in October 1943 and never came back. And the man who remained after it left was a smaller, quieter, more careful version of the one who had driven to a Harlem market 6 weeks earlier in a white linen jacket, feeling like the future belonged to him. The soldiers went first. 3 days, one by one, each departure wrapped in its own explanation. A family situation in New Jersey, An offer from another operation that was difficult to refuse under current circumstances. A man who simply stopped appearing and whose apartment, when someone finally went to check, had been vacated cleanly. The landlord, mildly surprised to have received a month's rent in advance, and found the place empty the following morning. Each explanation was individually believable. The accumulation of them across 3 days was something else entirely. It was men reading a situation and choosing the exit before the exit chose them. 4 men remained by Thursday evening. Moretti looked at them across the Carroll Street table and understood with complete clarity that he was not looking at loyalty. He was looking at men who had not yet received better offers, who were staying the way passengers stay on a slowing train. Not because they believe in the destination, but because they have not yet identified a better way off. The money had been bleeding longer than the men. The Harlem revenue had stopped in the first week, a loss that had been manageable against 8 years of reserves. What destroyed the reserves was the warehouse closure, 48 hours of suspended operations that cost more per day than most of his remaining men earned in a month, combined with the termination of 2 syndicate-connected financing arrangements that had allowed him to operate at a scale his own capital could not have supported alone. Both terminations arrived by phone, both calls brief and polite. Both callers using the specific neutral language of men who have already made a decision and are communicating it as fact rather than opening a negotiation. The politeness was the worst part. In that world, politeness was what men used when the conversation was already over and they simply had not told you yet. Bumpy received the final accounting on a Wednesday morning. Roosevelt laid it out without embellishment, reading from a small notebook in the flat, precise voice of a man delivering a weather report. 4 men remaining. Operating capital exhausted. 2 primary revenue streams closed. Police protection terminated. Syndicate relationship severed. Harlem operation completely and permanently dismantled. He looked up when he finished and waited. Bumpy was quiet for a long moment, outside the window. 2 children were arguing about the rules of a game with the absolute conviction of people for whom this argument is the most important thing currently happening in the world. He watched them for a moment. Then he said, "Does he know it's over?" Roosevelt said, "He knows." "Does he know why?" Roosevelt considered this. He said he knows what happened. Whether he understands why is a different question. Some men in that position spend years reconstructing it and still get the answer wrong. They look for the move that defeated them, and they find a dozen candidates, and they never settle on the right one because the right one doesn't look like a move. It looks like a consequence. Bumpy looked at him. He said, "Send word. Tell him Harlem has no further business with him as long as he has no further business with Harlem. No conditions beyond that. No requirements. Just the boundary." Stated once. The message traveled through 4 people and arrived as information rather than a communication from an identifiable source. Moretti received it that afternoon in the Carroll Street restaurant, sitting alone at the table where he had once conducted meetings attended by 23 men. He read it twice. He folded it in thirds and put it in his jacket pocket. He sat with his wine for a long time without drinking it, watching the street through the window, watching ordinary people move through an ordinary afternoon with the specific envy of a man who has just lost the thing that made him extraordinary and is not yet sure who he is without it. He never returned to Harlem. Not that month. Not that year. Not in any year that followed for the rest of his life. He continued to exist in reduced form, operating carefully in reduced territory. A man whose radius had been permanently compressed from something expanding to something contained. Men who knew him in later years described him as cautious in a way he had not been before, deliberate, unwilling to overreach in any direction, as if he carried the memory of overreaching the way a broken bone carries the memory of breaking, not as pain, exactly, but as a permanent awareness of a specific kind of vulnerability that had not existed before the injury. Elijah Wade heard the full account on a Thursday evening, told to him by a neighbor whose cousin had been present at enough of the right moments to have assembled most of the picture. He listened to all of it, sitting in his kitchen with the hickory cane across his knees and the brown hat on the table, and a cup of tea he kept forgetting to drink. When the telling was finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I never told those families where the food was coming from. I told them it was from a church collection upstate. I didn't want them to know what it cost to get it." He picked up the teacup. It had gone completely cold. He drank it anyway. Some things you carry alone, not because you're ashamed of them, because other people shouldn't have to know that their survival required that kind of price. What Harlem remembered from the fall of 1943 was carried the way the neighborhood carried all its truest knowledge, not in documents or newspapers or official records, most of which either omitted these events entirely or recorded only their most surface-level consequences, but in the specific compressed language that communities develop for transmitting what actually matters across generations. An older person tells a younger one, in a sentence or two, the essential thing. The younger one carries it until they become the older one. The sentence changes slightly with each telling, but the meaning does not. The meaning was this: the most dangerous man in any room is not the one who hits hardest or moves fastest or carries the most firepower. The most dangerous man is the one who understands the room completely before he moves at all, who knows which floor will hold, which door is already unlocked, which name spoken, in which ear will produce which consequence 3 weeks later, in a location no one would think to connect to that conversation. Carlo Moretti had come to Harlem to demonstrate that patience was weakness, and that a man willing to be brutal in public could rewrite the rules of any neighborhood he chose. He had driven home from a vegetable market believing he had just purchased, at the cost of one slap and one afternoon, something that would have taken months of conventional pressure to achieve. He had purchased something. He had simply purchased the wrong thing. He had purchased Bumpy Johnson's complete attention, at a moment when Bumpy Johnson had both the information and the architecture to make that attention the most expensive thing Carlo Moretti had ever earned. The white linen jacket had cost more than most men on that block made in a month. The lesson it bought him cost considerably more than that. And unlike the jacket, it was not something he could take off when the weather changed. The morning after Moretti left Harlem for the last time, nothing looked different. Same market, same vendors, same children running the same streets. But something had settled underneath all of it, deeper, quieter, and permanent. Elijah Wade walked through that market 3 days later. Hickory cane, brown hat, and every person he passed nodded first, not out of pity, out of recognition. Bumpy Johnson never made a speech. He never needed to, because in Harlem, the most dangerous verdict was the one delivered in complete silence. If these buried stories move you, subscribe and hit the bell. New stories drop every week. Thank you for watching until the end. Now tell us, do you believe real power ever needs to announce itself? Drop your answer below.